Welcome to the second session of our Resilience Talks learning series with our host, Milton Friesen. In this dynamic four-part series, Milton will be joined by thought leaders from across the country to explore urban dynamics that contribute to resilience in our cities and communities. Today's session is entitled Resilience and Space, and Milton has invited special guest Emily Munroe to join him to discuss theories of social resilience and provide examples of inclusive, sustainable, and healthy community practices, and explore key elements of spatial literacy and engaging communities in conversations about building places for people. I'd like to welcome the host of the Resilience Talk series, Milton Friesen, to the session today. Milton is one of our thought leaders here at Tamarack and is a senior fellow and program director of social cities at Cardis, a North American think tank. He has served as an elected municipal official, and his current work at the University of Waterloo School of Planning involves a new proposal for measuring social impact. His work on network science applications for planning includes participation in the Waterloo Institute on Complexity and Innovation. His paper, Social Infrastructure Underpinning the Success of Cities, explores the patterns of relationships we have with each other as individuals and groups, and suggests that these will determine the long-term viability of where we live. This paper was recently published in Municipal World. I would also like to welcome our special guest for today's session, Emily Munroe. Emily is the Executive Director of 880 Cities and has been there since 2009. She has managed diverse engagement and capacity building projects both locally and internationally. She has led major projects with partners such as the Ontario Government, the Knight Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Gell Architects. Emily is passionate about making healthy choices easy for everyone, every day, by creating cities where people can walk, bike, and play. She uses her creativity and problem-solving skills to develop stimulating and imaginative strategies to engage people in the process of improving their cities. We are so delighted to welcome you both and appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and experiences with us today. I will now turn it over to you, Milton, to explore the connections between resilience and space.
Great, thank you, Christy. I appreciate the introduction and orientation for us today, and I'm glad, Emily, that you were able to join us for the conversation.
Pleasure to be here.
Just as we get started, to continue kind of with the theme that we've been working through in our last webinar looking at resilience, I just want to reintroduce the idea of what resilience means. It's quite prevalent in anybody who's working around cities or urban development or community development. And even in international relations and international development, there's a lot of discussion about resilience. So I think a useful working definition, is one that the City Resilience Framework has used, and they use this definition. Resilience is the capacity of cities to function so that the people living and working in cities, particularly the poor and vulnerable, survive and thrive no matter what stresses or shocks they encounter. So the idea of resilience being, connected with the ability to respond to change, and to respond to change in a way that lets us keep doing what's important, or to continue to survive and thrive and move forward. So we're using that as a kind of background framework today for our conversation. And what we're going to do is take that idea and ask questions around that related to the idea of how we organize the space in our cities and our communities, our streets, and all of the different parts that function together to make cities what they are. And for that, we have Emily's expertise and experience because she's involved with a really interesting project that's looking at making cities more livable for humans, and that there's some really interesting dynamics there that we're going to explore today. How we organize our space and ourselves says a lot about how we might respond to future challenges and to current challenges. You can imagine a kind of microcosm in our homes where we have some spaces that are designed to be more private. We have some that are sort of, the whole family gathers, and then we have some that are even more public, maybe our front porch or our sidewalk outside our home, where people are able to kind of come and go freely. And then there's sort of these gradients all the way along that have something to do with how we organize the space and the purposes that we need. And cities are a bit like that too. They have different functions, different spaces. And today we're going to focus on the role that those spaces play in helping us to respond to change or improving the quality of life in our cities. And we'll talk about the good side of that, where we're getting that right. And then we're also going to take a look at some aspects of that where perhaps we have lessons yet to learn and where we have some challenges in front of us. And Emily's going to be our guide through some of the space and the places that she's seen and help us think through this. So let's start with the basic question, which is to hear from you, Emily, what 880 Cities is about, its core ideas and orientation, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved with them.
Yeah, sure. So 880 Cities is a not-for-profit organization based in Toronto, but we do work both locally, nationally, and internationally. And a lot of people ask us what the name 880 Cities actually means. Where does it come from? Is it the number of cities we've worked in? Is it our address? But really it's a very simple and important philosophy that guides all of the work that we do. And it comes from the idea that if you create a city that's great for an 8-year-old and great for an 80-year-old, then you'll create a wonderful city for everybody else. When we talk about cities as well, something that I like to make sure people understand about that philosophy is the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old in our definition are an indicator species, and they really just help us to think differently about our cities and to remember the most vulnerable people in our cities. So the 8-year-old and the 80-year-old really represent an inclusive community, people of low income, people with disabilities, children, older adults, and people of all ages, of course. So that's the basic philosophy. And a key piece of that, of course, is how that perspective ends up shaping how we build our cities. And our belief is that if we use this kind of 880 rule as a guiding principle, that our cities really, in many cases, would look different than they do today. And that's what we are working towards with the work that we do, either through partnerships with funders or directly with municipalities. And I came to work at 880 Cities. A lot of the people on my team are urban planners, but my background's actually community development. So I'm the most heavily involved in kind of the process of planning ways that community members can get involved in planning and making decisions related to their cities.
So 880 is it's a community, so it operates in its most significant kind of role at a community level. Is that, if we're trying to get a sense of the scale at which 880 Cities is operating, would you characterize that as community level? So people that are involved in neighborhood associations or are involved with kind of that front line of even of city services?
I would say that we spend most of our time in many ways representing those groups, but in terms of the time that we actually spend interacting with different actors in cities, I would say we spend a pretty equal amount of time interacting with community level organizers as well as city government and decision makers, because our role is often to play that liaison between the two, trying to articulate the needs of the community to city government and vice versa, trying to explain the position sometimes of government to community members, why certain projects can move forward and perhaps why they can't, or why an idea is actually very good, and kind of what the boundaries of those projects might be.
Okay. Related to context as well, are you involved in, so you mentioned planners, that there's some, planners are quite actively involved in your work. Are you looking at new developments, speaking into those design processes for what's not yet built?
Yeah.
Or do you find yourself spending more, are you more involved with saying, okay, well, this is the infrastructure we have, these are the streets, and these are the, housing types and buildings and the layout we currently have, and, that you work in and around that to try to improve the performance of the existing infrastructure?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think my answer speaks to how much work there is to be done. We do work on both sides. We spend a lot of time, especially looking at downtowns, which tend to be older, generally speaking, and downtowns are such a critical and delicate, and I repeat, delicate piece of a city's ecosystem that we really spend a lot of time looking and thinking about and advocating for changes to downtowns. At the same time, our cities, especially in Canada and in many metropolitan areas, are growing so quickly. We also have to have our eye on what's happening in new development and we're equally concerned about that as well, because new developments, generally speaking, are some of the places that we see some of the most significant kind of errors taking place in terms of what perhaps good decisions are related to urban design.
Okay, good. That's helpful. Let's go back to the 880. So let's start with the 8-year-olds. So if 8-year-olds are happy in a city, what do the spaces and places look like? That would be, if they're the indicator species, what sort of things would characterize spaces where they're the most happy and doing the best and thriving? And then I'll ask the same question on the 80-year-old side. Are they the same kinds of things, or it's just that they're kind of at different edges of the time span, and so they each have some distinctive needs? But let's start with the 8-year-olds. What makes 8-year-olds happy in the city other than ice cream cones?
Well, ice cream cones are important, and they are a really critical feature of a city. Access to food that people enjoy and can build community around. But on both sides of the spectrum, by far one of the most important factors is mobility. And we strongly believe that children, even starting as young as 8, have a right to mobility. They have a right to have some independence and decision-making capabilities in terms of how they get around in their communities. So creating places that are walkable and are bikeable are critical to creating a city that an 8-year-old can really explore and enjoy.
Okay. And how does that apply to the 80-year-olds? I can guess some possibilities, but I'll let you maybe explain for us how that works on the other end of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, it's very similar. In many ways, the needs are similar in terms of mobility, making sure that there's potential for individual forms of mobility that go beyond the personal automobile, and making sure that those elements in a city are safe. So I'll use an example of pedestrian infrastructure and speed limits on city roads. This is something that we've spent a long time advocating for, is the reduction of speed limits on neighborhood roads. This is something that is great for seniors and children. Children are often out. They want the opportunity to be able to play in their neighborhood streets. It's something that many people of an older generation would have had the opportunity to do. And now in lots of cases, there's nowhere that children are more afraid than in their neighborhood streets, waiting on watch for a car to come by when they're playing. So we are constantly advocating for the reduction of city speed limits to 30 kilometers an hour. Now, on the flip side of that, for the older adults are much more likely to die in a pedestrian injury, in a pedestrian collision. And your chances of dying in a pedestrian collision that occurs at 50 kilometers an hour is 85%, and that drops down to just 5% if you're going at 30 kilometers an hour. So there's significant impact on either end of the spectrum in terms of how people can actually enjoy their cities, and oftentimes residents are concerned that a reduction in speed limits on neighborhood roads to 30 kilometers an hour will grind traffic to a halt, but that's really not the reality. And in some cases, cities have actually managed to make their transportation networks more efficient by reducing speed limits and making changes to lighting and like the light systems, which actually allows transportation to run more effectively.
Right. Okay. This reminds me of a video I saw recently on the Congress for the New Urbanism in Toronto. They had a film festival, and there's another one's coming up. And they had a little short vignette about these couple of kids trying to walk to school. And it's shot in the wintertime, and the camera just sort of follows these kids as they walk along this, sort of snowbanked suburban street. Meanwhile, cars are going by quite quickly. There's no sidewalk, nothing's shoveled. They're sort of stumbling their way, and you feel kind of almost afraid for them because it does look hazardous, which is the point of the short film, which is to say, in certain areas, the neighborhood is far from walkable. It's not safe. It's certainly not someplace you'd let your kids go by themselves. Can we now? I'd like to introduce the social side of this. So people might look at what you're saying and agree. Yeah. So we just need to change speed limits. We need to make sure there's sort of mobility issues. But if we think of the idea of resilience, how do these sorts of changes that would lower speed limits, that would increase access for the young and the old, how does that contribute to kind of the overall well-being of a community? So if we think of its social resilience, its ability to respond to change, the ability or the opportunity people have to, to draw on the resources that other people have in a time of need and to offer those in return when they are able to do that. Is there a linkage here, or are these just kind of, structural changes that need to happen? How do you, is there a strong social element in terms of the resilience side of designing for these types of communities?
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case to be made that communities that are designed thinking of the 8-year-olds and thinking of the 80-year-olds are more resilient communities. There's been a lot of research conducted by a research group in the US out of Portland called City Observatory, and they wrote a report called Less in Common, and it relates to how we've built our cities has actually created poor social networks between citizens. So an example of this is that since the 1970s, distrust among Americans is actually decreasing, that more people mistrust their neighbors. People spend significantly less time with their neighbors now than they did 30 years ago. And I think many people on this call would recognize that we spend much more time watching television and in front of screens, but now our biggest portion of leisure time is actually watching television. And our recreation is increasingly privatized. So the time that we used to spend actually getting together with community, meeting your neighbors, making those critical social connections has been dramatically reduced by the way we actually build our communities. And that can go from how we build our residential areas to how we build our community centers and how we get around. So I think there's a very, very strong connection with resilience and making sure that communities facilitate the process of meeting and connecting with their neighbors on an even kind of playing field in a public space. And that's something that we have begun to lose over time. Another, one of the most compelling examples that I've seen, one of the sort of most moving and sad examples that I've seen where city planning has affected resilience was after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, when you could see, you could visually see who was left in the city without supports. They were people that did not have access to personal automobiles because the emergency planning system was based on people actually being able to drive out of the city. And the people that remained stuck on the rooftops were people who generally relied on transit and didn't have the social networks that allowed them to connect with people that had personal automobiles. That was a clear indication of how we build our city can really affect how we can be resilient in times of crisis.
Right. This sounds, and I know you're familiar with kind of the work done by, around the idea of the human scale, that cities that are able to kind of get down to the granularity of sort of that walking pace or the scale at which human interaction can actually occur tend to see an increase in quality of life. People report a much stronger sense of belonging, and they're able to take advantage of not necessarily that everyone on the street is a best friend, but they have, at least there's opportunity for some interaction and the feeling that it's at least possible that there's interaction, which is quite different than when we're in our vehicles sort of racing past each other. I've noticed in the GTA here that people tend not to like to drive slowly. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. There's a race to get somewhere no matter where you're going. And usually that doesn't bring out the best in people. We're often quite intent about whatever's in front of us, and it's usually another vehicle, and we're not usually happy about that. So you can see the downsides there. Can you give us an example of some projects you've been involved with? I know you had given one at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities when we were talking about social capital, and I'm sure you've got others where you were able to come into a community, take a look at what's there, and then kind of move things towards a more a better place for the 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds, and increase the social connectivity and sense of well-being in a place. Do you, an example or two of that from your own work or from others that that have made that sort of adjustment would be probably helpful for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the a great project that we were involved in, and I think really spoke to how you can make the most of social capital in your own community, was a project that we worked on in Cochrane, Ontario, which is in northern Ontario, and we were partnering with the city of Cochrane on a project that was partially funded by the Ontario government, and it was called the Doable Neighborhood Project. And the whole idea behind this project was looking for sort of small-scale changes that could have a larger and wider spread impact. And some people from the town of Cochrane, had been interested in the idea of having a bike share program. I'm sure many of the listeners today are familiar with bike share programs like we have in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Washington, lots of cities around the world. But these are multi-million-dollar investments in a bike share program, and it wasn't suitable to a town the size of Cochrane, which was about 6,000 people. So they knew that if they wanted to create this bike share program, that they would have to think differently about how they would implement it in their own town. So what they did was they worked with the police force to recondition, to maintain and bring it up to proper working order with a bunch of trained students in mechanics, in bicycle mechanics. They used the reclaimed stolen bicycles that the police department had. They fixed them up with a group of young people. They painted them bright colors and they spread them throughout the town. I think there was probably about 100 bicycles that were included in the launch of the bike share program. And they didn't have these sophisticated anti-theft measures that lots of the more robust programs would have. They had, signage, take a bike, please return it. They were brightly colored so that they were visible within the city. And the city really took the approach that if the worst thing that happened was that somebody stole a bicycle, that's not really such a bad thing. Perhaps they needed it, perhaps they're going to be getting physically active, and hopefully it will get returned. And they had a very low rate of actually having the bike stolen. Most of them were returned. They've managed to keep the bike share program going, and this year, just last year actually, they implemented some of their first bike lanes within the town. So I think that is a great example of a town taking an idea, making it work for this scale and what their financial resources were, and bringing something to a city that allowed people to think differently about what was possible.
So the scale of the projects can range from more broad kind of long-term investments to more short-term community development type projects like that just make the city more accessible to people or fill a niche of some kind that's been identified by citizens. So on this, going back to your connection with 880, how did you get started with them, and what sorts of kind of core ideas have inspired your work as you've carried some of these projects to fruition? I think from your bio, it looks like you started in 2009, somewhere around then, so you've been at this for a few years now. But how did you get there, and what's your trajectory been in terms of some of the key ideas that have influenced your thinking, or the people that have shaped your thinking about how place is related to our own resilience and response to change?
Yeah, so my background, as I mentioned, was in community development. I went to McGill and I did some courses at Humber in international development as well. And I was actually interested, and still am, of course, in international travel, but ended up seeing this position at 880 Cities, which was focused on working at a community level to develop community-based plans for improving walkability and bikeability in Ontario. And for me, it was a perfect fit. And that was the first major project that I managed. We were working in 19 communities across the province. And that initial taste, which was very grassroots, really allowed me to connect with a diversity of people and places across the province. I think that initial interaction with 880 Cities and the work that we do really helped to shape the way that I have continued to think about what work we will do in the future, now that I'm now the executive director of the organization. And the main thing, and this goes back to our philosophy, is really trying to approach city building and city design with a lens of fairness and equity. I think it's very easy to get caught up in the flashiest development projects. And I think that oftentimes there is a time and a place for major investments and, world-class projects with the top-of-the-line materials. But I think that overall, with our cities, there has to be an approach that recognizes the importance of fairness and equity and how our decisions affect the most vulnerable people in our communities. So that's really been the focus of my work since then, and we approach that in many different ways. You know, we're always involved in new and different projects, and sometimes the approach can seem counterintuitive to a certain degree. We're working with the Knight Foundation in the US, which has allowed us to take on some very innovative work, and if we can find a funder in Canada to fund the same kind, please let us know. But they've allowed us to take 3 times now decision makers from across the US to Copenhagen to study that city and to immerse decision makers for a week in the city of Copenhagen so that they can really, really see how differently we can build and design our cities. And it just speaks to how you need different approaches to get people to think differently, and something that I would love to see in the Canadian context is in some cases a little bit more risk-taking when it comes to thinking about how we can fund projects, what types of projects we can fund. I think it's really important to think outside the box and try some things in our cities.
So if you're leading a team, someone's listening, you know, they're responsible for a team or a group of people, or they're part of a team, and they can't afford to go to Copenhagen, but they would like to get a bit of a visceral sense of, you know, what a good space looks like, and what a sort of a sociable space looks like, or how to get themselves into that kind of space to shape their own thinking and experience. Do you have any tips, advice, or ways that people might do that to try to deepen their own capacities, both to think about it, experience it? Because often we have an inkling like, hey, that sounds really interesting, I'd like to try that, or we might have a counter, you know, kind of a counter intuition which says my team wouldn't go for that, or we just don't do that sort of thing, or that doesn't work in our community. I think clearly from some of your examples, it's got the full range of possibilities in terms of how to connect into it. But if people are trying to get into that space and immerse themselves in it, are there any resources or strategies or tactics that you might suggest from your experience that they could take hold of to bring into their own setting?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things that come to mind. One, there's lots of places to look at that are fantastic other than Copenhagen. Copenhagen is just kind of like, you know, the best of the best to a certain degree. But cities like Montreal, Quebec City, Victoria, Vancouver, there's lots and lots of cities. I'm from a very small town. There's wonderful small towns across Canada. And I think that the places to look are often the main streets. At 880 Cities, we often hear this hope that new technology, like driverless cars and all sorts of other things, are going to get us out of the transportation challenges that we have. It's my view that we already know what works, and that is to focus our cities around walking, cycling, transit, and of course the personal automobile. So I think looking at good main streets in cities of all sizes across the country is a good place to start. I think the other thing, and this is really key to getting people bought into new ideas and new projects within a city or a town, especially if there's some resistance there, is to just try things on a small scale, whether that's in your main street or within a prominent park. A great example of something that we've seen really work well to get people to think differently about the possibilities in their cities is what we call open streets programs. So this is where on Sunday mornings for a few hours you close the street, a main street, to cars and open it to people. And that they come out, run, walk, bike, play, participate in other activities along the street, and that's something that any city, any town of any character can undertake, and you can help people to just feel differently about how they move and interact with their cities. I think there's lots of examples of different types of kind of pilot projects or initiatives that cities can take on to help people see their city in a different way.
We have open streets here in Hamilton, and it's interesting the first time or two that people are there, it's a little bit, it's like we kind of don't really know what to do with the space. You know, it's sort of the cars are usually here, and now we can actually walk wherever we like across the street. You don't have to look both ways. You know, you're just sort of in a much different space, and clearly there's room to adjust to the idea and actually to be able to appreciate and take full advantage of, like, well, what does this mean? And it means, well, what would you like to do here? You know, do you want to organize an event? Do you want to set something up? Do you want to play a game? Do you want to just sit on a lawn chair in the middle of the street? Because you can do all of that. You know, it's all possible, but it takes time, I think, in some cases for people to actually appreciate what could happen. And but the space sometimes sparks that creativity, like, oh, right, I didn't really think about this until just now, and now I have a chance to kind of move it forward. So you'd mentioned about risks, that we need to perhaps have a little more leaning forward into the risk space when we're doing these kinds of projects, even if they're small, risking that they might not work. And of course, exploring a new space means that things won't always work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any examples of projects that you can talk about, or maybe anecdotes of, it seemed like a good idea, kind of went for it, and it just didn't work the way we'd hoped? And because I think a lot of us can relate with things attempted and not necessarily always successful in the ways that we thought, at least not initially. And sometimes they are successful in ways we didn't anticipate, but sometimes they don't work. We learn. And we sort of remember the failures and hopefully carry them forward into another attempt. But I think everyone can relate to the idea that they've tried to float an idea or introduce something and it just didn't go over. Can you share with us any examples of that to make us all feel like we're not alone?
Of course. Of course. We've had plenty. We've had our share. We are always trying to do things like creatively and differently, and sometimes it doesn't work out the way you imagined. But honestly, I think that the cases that I've seen the most frequency of failure is when there are kind of half measures introduced. So when an open streets program or project is a perfect example of that. So the best place to do an open streets program is on whatever your most iconic street is. So I'm involved in organizing the open streets program in Toronto. So we do it on Yonge Street and Bloor Street, streets that are familiar to many people across Canada. These are not easy streets to shut down. It was not easy to convince city government that those are the streets that we should do it on. However, I've seen many, many open streets programs fail because initially they choose the easy street rather than the good street. And I would apply that learning to many different types of sort of pilot projects. The same thing can definitely be said of a bicycle infrastructure where a city decides that we're going to test out a bike lane, but we're going to do it on the easiest street rather than the best street. Or they try out one lane that's half or 1 kilometer long instead of making it a little bit of a grid network or connecting to the important destinations. Yeah. So in my experience, the highest rate of failure has been when you haven't made the decision that is best for the project and you've taken the easy choice. And then I think the other case where you can really increase your chances of success is by bringing a really broad network of people together in support of a specific project. So making sure that you have lots of different voices at the table, providing input and addressing concerns and acting together as a team when these projects are implemented.
Which would be a great example of sometimes quiet or maybe less visible part of these projects, which is that social resilience side, right? The ability to bring people together, to have strong networks, to bring partners into play, and to bring local organizations, institutions, and groups together to kind of support it. That sometimes is, in my experience, that's the hard labor. It kind of goes on behind the scenes. It takes meetings and other things that people might not like, or it takes reaching out across maybe sectors that don't necessarily always interact with each other, or groups that maybe see themselves as outsiders and yet are quite critical to a neighborhood, and weaving them into it and bringing them in that sort of involved capacity. And so that's good to hear that, that those attempts work best where those ties are strongest. And that may be another thing to, another indicator as well, that even if you have an idea but there's no people around it, it's going to be a tough thing to see it really succeed. I know you had another example from when I've heard you speak before, that of looking at a case where you can create a space where people could do things, but you also have to invest at the same time in doing something good in that space. That it's just because you clear it and make it open and available doesn't mean it's automatically sort of fully utilized or well used. There's that programming and developing side of what to do with these spaces. Could you speak to that? Because I think that's sometimes we work hard to get a project through where we get clearance to either do a block party or we want to do something on the street. But if at the same time we're not putting efforts and a lot of planning and effort into something good to go into that space, sometimes it kind of fades out or never really sees its full potential, and people think, oh, that didn't work. And well, I think it's like you said, it worked, but it was only a half measure. You know, you got the front half right, which is you need the space, but the other half is kind of making sure that there's something going on in the space.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because it is a key part of making sure that our cities are animated and well connected to people. So something that we do see time and again is a massive investment, but usually or oftentimes in a park or a public space, where there's this fantastic design, and then the design, the capital infrastructure is built, and then it's kind of like, okay, well, all we need to do is cut the grass and pick up the trash, and the space should work for itself. And there's very few occasions that I've seen where that is how you make a great park or public space. And thinking of the suburban context, where in many cases they have access to very good green space, I think in a lot of cases the part that is forgotten, both in urban areas, but I see it very frequently in suburban areas, is that those spaces actually need to be animated to get people out and using them. So that could be, we've seen fantastic programs from knitting groups to walking clubs to huge structured water fights. There's so many different things that you can do in a park or public space, but somebody, whether it's a community group or the city, somebody needs to be thinking about how those spaces are animated so that it attracts people and that it is thoughtfully attracting a wide diversity of people within the city. One example that I'll give you of probably the most meticulously managed public space in the world is Bryant Park in New York City. And Bryant Park has tons of money. That's not the thing to focus on. But they are incredibly careful about measuring who is using the space and making sure that their programs match who they want to see in the space. So every day they count the ratio of men to women, and the male-female ratio in a public space is a really important indicator of how well a space is working. In a space that is feels kind of unsafe or dirty, you're going to see, generally speaking, you'll see a much lower percentage of women in the space. So Bryant Park specifically looks at the ratio of men to women in their park, and if they see the ratio increasing too high on the male side, they'll actually implement programs that are more appealing to the female audience to make sure that they balance out who is using this space. And that's the type of thinking that I think we really need to have when it comes to our parks and public spaces, to make them as vibrant and as equitable as we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that points to, I mean, that's a great example, and because I think that programming side is difficult. It's somebody has to take initiative. It requires often an ongoing kind of commitment. It's not just a one-time, kind of an, function that we have. I know I live near Gage Park here in Hamilton, and it's an 80-acre, urban park, and it's wonderful. Lots of room, lots of space, but what really animates that park is all the summer concerts that come through and events that happen in the park, and they run across the spectrum. So, some of them I can hear them from my house when there's a concert going on, and there's just something about that space being available anytime to go there, but it's also really good that there are functions that happen in and around it too that make it much more kind of a neighborhood gathering place. And even for the whole east end of the side of the city, it's just like a place people go, and it helps that things happen in it as well as being a great space. You can see both of them kind of functioning together. We've had a question here that I'll put to you. I think it's quite relevant to this as well. You mentioned funding on Bryant Park in New York City, but the question is, where have you seen people interested in funding open streets ideas or the placemaking kinds of projects that you've been involved with? Are there places where there's interest in it, or are people just going to have to sort of be creative and hunt in their own contexts? And maybe that's the funding side of, which is a signal of interest, a signal of investment that you might be able to help people get a better sense of.
Great question, and it's one that we hear in almost every city and town we work in. So one part is where I would love for the funding to come from. I would love to see more municipalities fund programs like Open Streets and put some more money into placemaking. I completely understand that finances are stretched in many of the municipalities, and I think that there's another conversation sort of separate to this about how can we restructure how we use some of those funds.
Right.
Aside from municipalities, and we've seen municipalities, just to be clear, fund open streets programs in many cities, a number of which are here in Canada and a number of which are in the US and Latin America. We have been successful finding some funding from provincial governments for things like open streets, specifically ones devoted to improving community health. And we've also found private funders. So those could be corporations. For instance, in Toronto with our Open Streets program, we have a number of corporations that provide sponsorship or donations to the program. And then in a number of cases, we also see foundations, private trusts, that kind of thing, putting up some money for some of the more kind of creative approaches to city animation and city building. But it is, every city that we work in, it is kind of a treasure hunting mission, trying to figure out where those funds can come from. And, you know, sadly, in some cities, the only thing that has really stood between implementing an open streets program multiple times is lack of funding and nothing else. The political support is there, the public support is there. It's just a matter of figuring out where you can get that money from. Right.
And in some cases, it's a matter of not looking for more, but different ways of investing what's already committed to budgets. You know, is there sort of complementarity that can happen? Is there some ways in which you know, people can find, you know, as you were saying earlier, even the experimental projects, not to get stuck on, well, we don't have money to do it at this scale, but the question could be, well, at what scale would we have some money to try it, or do we even need money? Do we just need to get ourselves organized and do something that's very low cost, you know, to kind of begin to build some momentum and move a project forward? From another angle, another question is asking about the development side. So if we kind of zoom back and say, okay, that's an existing neighborhood with existing resources, we want to tweak and adjust it. But if we look back and talk about working with builders, developers, architects, you know, landscape architects, et cetera, in terms of making spaces, are there any strategies in working at that scale that people could think of in terms of making the case for having this greater livability in our cities that you've seen succeed in the past?
Yeah, so I think that, and I think it's kind of commonplace in the world that I work in this kind of urbanist world, to sometimes demonize developers. I think that there's a lot of developers out there that are really interested in creating good urban environments. And I think part of it is just opening up the conversation between developers, citizens, and municipalities about what types of developments they'd like to see. And I think another is you know, making sure that there's guidelines within municipalities that help to enforce decisions that have been made about how they want to see their city grow. I know there's a region close to Toronto that is looking at implementing some healthy design guidelines. So developers actually have to use these fairly structured research-based design guidelines to apply to their developments to make sure that they are encouraging physical activity. And I think that there's more efforts that can be done in terms of making sure that municipalities and regulators are working very, very, very closely with developers on some of those plans and designs. One example, a recent example, that kind of blew my mind here in Toronto a little while ago was we had a Target. You know, I'm sure many people are aware of the whole Target fiasco. There was a Target that moved in close to where I live on a main street in Toronto. It's like a big box store. Target gutted the entire building that they had moved into, and they didn't put a single pedestrian entrance on the frontage facing a main street. It was like set way back within the development. And those little things, I mean, it completely changes how people in that whole area are going to interact with the street. And I think that had a constructive conversation happened between Target and the municipality, that could have been avoided, and it will have long-term consequences for the whole area.
Yeah, And that is one of the challenges of the built environment, is that its influence goes on for such a long time. Even if it was, pragmatic decisions, or sometimes people were just sort of unaware in their sort of haste to build or push things through what the impact is spatially, and then its long-term social impacts can often be quite detrimental, or in the case where we got it right, it continues to provide benefits, over the long haul. So yeah, I think that's a good example of where it doesn't always work out. Is there a challenge though with, again, on getting something built, sort of the capital side? That's one aspect of the conversation, getting well-designed spaces, getting them put in place, developers sort of meeting their requirements from a code and other vantage points. But the money that goes into the programming side, is there a conversation to be had about doing more than just linking requirements to sort of the development of the physical space within its framework, but also thinking about that animating aspect of it? Can we do more along that front? Because it seems to me, I remember, as a municipal councillor, we always talked about, you can usually find money for a capital campaign, but what's really tough is what's going to happen with the operating cost over the long haul. Like, how do you actually make sure the facility is fully used? How's it going to be run, and those sorts of things? And it's just from our earlier questions and conversation around programming spaces, it seems there's more to be done along that axis too, about how do we get funding attached to that programming sort of side.
Yeah, so I'm going to focus on kind of one piece of that question, I think, because I have thoughts related to some of the funding side where perhaps more funding could come from within, specifically within municipalities. But I think one of the big opportunities in terms of relationship building between municipalities and citizen groups, and also that investment in social capital and resilience, is through partnerships. I don't think that the animation of public space needs to be conducted literally by employees of the municipality or of a municipality or a development. I think there's so many eager community groups that want to help to animate parks and public spaces, and yet either they aren't aware that there is an opportunity there for them to do so, or they face barriers like 30-page long permit instructions when they want to have a group of more than 20 people gather in a public space at a single time. There was a great example of a project that we worked on, but it was really led by the Centertown Community Health Center in Ottawa. So the Centertown Community Health Center recognized that this park in their neighborhood was underperforming. It's called Dundonald Park. And they truly believed that that park could be an extension of creating a healthier community. So what they did was they took on the role of being kind of this partnership coordinator among community groups within their neighborhood, and they put together a calendar of programmed events for that space, and they have truly managed to transform Dundonald Park. And the City of Ottawa recognizes the incredible contributions that they've made to improving that park in terms of safety and animation. And really, in that case, it was just a matter of finding a way of inviting community members to participate in the animation of that space. And I think that's something that cities across Ontario can do, across Canada can do better than we have in the past. And I think also that people like Centertown Community Health Center or other health centers and lots of different organizations like libraries and community centers can recognize that their space exists beyond the building that they happen to reside within. And maybe they can make some connections to help animate our cities in a different way.
And that is a case of, again, not necessarily more resources overall, but better using what we already have, perhaps in unique combinations, to make use of that kind of institutional capacity where it's there or where it's not. Citizens simply working together to collaborate. One last question, or nearly last, as we're getting close to the end of our time. Sometimes you hear people being quite pessimistic that, that people are disconnected, they're socially isolated, they're not voting anymore, they just don't seem to care, they've kind of washed their hands of that sort of thing. And they're just sort of looking after themselves. Do people care enough to make this kind of, ongoing function sustainable? Do they care enough to keep at this, or is it just going to be keeners like you and me and maybe a few other people who think it's a great thing and work at it, but you know, we're the odd exceptions. You know, it just happens to be our peculiar hobby, and well, good for you, but you know, the rest of us, we're not really that interested. If someone is cynical or pessimistic about that sort of engagement, you know, would you have an answer for them, or how would you set them straight?
Well, I mean, of course, in the work that we do, we're always very optimistic that there's a huge desire by community to get involved in creating better communities for themselves and for people beyond themselves. That doesn't always mean it's easy. You know, I think that you can look town by town, city by city, at places where they're starting at a different place in terms of social capital. And I think that in some places there's probably more work to do to provide some good and positive experiences to everyday people about getting involved in their cities, where it feels natural, it feels enforced, it feels rewarding. And I think that there's like it's this whole ecosystem that has to come together to work to create an environment where people want to contribute. And it's a two-way street, or a five-way street, between citizens and neighbors, and between businesses and community and municipalities and city staff and elected officials. And they all do have to kind of work in concert to a certain degree and support each other. But I think that the interest from community members is there. It just has to be kind of brought to the surface somehow.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent, Emily. Thanks. Those are very great thoughts and reflections, good examples and stories for all of us, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. I'm going to turn it back over to Christy, since we're right at our 1:55 mark, and she's going to give us some concluding thoughts and instructions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again, Milton and Emily, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us on the call today. That was really eye-opening in both ideas and possibilities, but also some really concrete and tangible examples of amazing work that can be done and transforming our understanding of community engagement. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everyone for your comments and questions. They've really helped to make this a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation. I also just want to take a quick second to thank our supporters on the call, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, the Maytree Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario. As promised, in a few days we will email you links to the audio and other material related to today's call. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack to let us know how we're doing. We encourage you to go online and register for the next session, Resilience and Measurement, on Tuesday, May 17th. That's next week from 1 to 2 p.m. Milton will be joined by Josh Yates of the Thriving Cities Project at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. We're also excited to continue exploring the theme of community resilience in Edmonton, Alberta for our Deepening Community National Gathering on June 7th to 9th. So for more information on this event, please go to our event page at events.tamarackcommunity.ca/DC Edmonton. We also have some other exciting webinars coming up in May, including a webinar gearing up for social impact with guests Brenton Caffin of Nesta and Tim Drayman of the Social Innovation Generation, which is also next week on the 18th of May, and we hope you'll join us. Finally, we have some other exciting events, both online and face-to-face, that are coming up this spring, and we encourage you to visit our website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca, to learn more and sign up for our monthly e-magazine Engage. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.